Modern Horizon 3 just released, and it brought with it a brand new modern meta. Your old favorite modern deck is probably dead, having been replaced by the new MH3 hotness. But do you ever wonder why this seems to happen every time a new direct-to-modern set is released? Well, today I'm going to share with you my thoughts as we talk about the profitability of power creep and the monetization of modern. This past December, former Wizards of the Coast president Cynthia Williams told a group of investors that she thought that Dungeons & Dragons, Wizards' most popular non-magic game, was under-monetized. From Wizards' perspective, D&D had a pretty big problem. That problem was a player could buy a rulebook and play with that same rulebook for years and years and years without giving Wizards any more money at all. This statement, combined with the recent release of Modern Horizons 3, got me thinking about the modern format. While they never said it publicly, I couldn't help but wonder if a few years ago, Wizards was saying the same thing. It's under-monetized, at least internally, about Modern itself. Traditionally, Modern is an expensive but stable format. Each standard set might have a few cards that are good enough to see play in the much larger and more powerful Modern format, but in general, Modern didn't change especially quickly. While the upfront cost of buying into Modern is super high, with decks costing hundreds or in some cases over $1,000, this was actually a pretty easy investment for a lot of players to make, because once you bought a Modern deck, you'd be able to play that same deck again and again and again for many years, which kind of made it just like the D&D rulebook. Sure, you could buy a standard deck for $300, but it would rotate in a year. Even if you have to spend $1,000 on a Modern deck, if you could play that same deck for 4 or 5 years, Modern would actually be cheaper than standard in the long run, and this is part of what made Modern into the most popular format in all of Magic in the mid-2010s. As Magic players, we tend to think of Magic as a game, and a great one at that, but it's important to remember that Wizards has a very different perspective. To Wizards, Magic is a product with a singular goal, which is to make as much money as possible for their shareholders. Well, Modern 10 years ago did make Wizards some money. It helped sell standard sets. You see cards like Deathrite Shaman that were mostly expensive because they were good in formats like Modern, and Wizards could use the staples of Modern to help sell master sets to make some extra change. This couldn't last forever. Eventually, Wizards ended up with a pretty big problem on their hands. They were going to run out of expensive Modern staples to reprint. Every time you reprint a card like Tarmogoyf, the price is going to drop a little bit. The first time Goyf was reprinted in the original Modern Masters, it cost over $200, and it caused the set to sell out almost instantly, often with boxes going way above MSRP, which was a thing back at that time. But by Modern Masters 2017, Tarmogoyf was down under $100, and by the time Time Spiral Remastered came out last year, it dropped as low as $10. At the same time, the handful of cards from standard sets that were actually good enough to show up in Modern simply weren't enough to replenish Wizards' supply of high-priced staples that they could use as reprints to sell master sets. From the perspective of a player, this might sound like a good thing, and in many ways it was. Having a card like Tarmogoyf go from $200 down to $20 meant that a much wider swath of the Magic community would actually be able to play with the iconic 2-drop if they wanted to. Sure, it kinda sucks if you were the person who spent $800 on a playset of Tarmogoyfs that are now worth like $70, but still in general, most Magic players would rather have cards be cheap and plentiful rather than expensive and scarce. Oh yeah, and if you need a cheap Tarmogoyf of your own, you can snag one from our sponsor Card Kingdom over at cardkingdom.com/MTGGoldfish. But for Wizards, this was a huge problem. They already had to deal with this super popular Modern format that didn't really make them very much money because Modern players just played their same old cards again and again and again for years. But making matters even worse from Wizards' perspective, now their most straightforward way of monetizing Modern, which was reprinting Modern staples in master sets, was starting to fizzle because the constant reprintings were dropping the prices of the old staples so much that it was making it harder to use them to sell packs. The foundation of Wizards' business model is super simple. Sell booster packs full of random Magic cards, with there being some chance that one of those random cards might be worth a lot of money on the secondary market. Essentially, boosters are lotto tickets. You know that the math is bad and that you're likely to lose, but there's a chance of getting lucky and winning big, and that keeps people dumping their paychecks into scratch-offs and their life savings into booster packs. But imagine if the grand prize of a lotto was 50 cents. Even the most degenerate gamblers are gonna pass on that one because there's literally no way to win. The more times Wizards reprinted Tarmogoyf, the more Tarmogoyf's price dropped, and the less effective it was at being the grand prize for opening an expensive booster pack. And this was essentially the problem that Wizards faced. They wanted to sell an increasingly large number of packs at an increasingly high price point, but they were at risk of running out of expensive grand prizes, the expensive cards to put in those packs. For Wizards, this was unacceptable. Sure, it was great that so many people liked playing Modern, but the format simply wasn't making them enough money. And remember, from Wizards' perspective, Magic exists not for us to enjoy playing, but for them to make money for their shareholders. Sometimes these two things go together. Wizards makes a fun game, so we reward them by giving us their money, but not always. How could Wizards fix the problem of Modern not only making them very little money, but a decreasing amount of money as their easy reprint targets like Tarmogoyf dropped in price? How could Wizards monetize Modern? The answer is actually super simple. Power creep, making new cards that are simply more powerful than the old ones. There was one big hurdle they'd have to clear, which was traditionally cards in Modern had to be printed into standard sets, and if Wizards wanted to print a bunch of cards that were so strong they were among the best cards in Modern, they would definitely break the much smaller standard format and have to be banned. But this one was pretty easy to solve. What if we just made a set that went directly into Modern and skipped standard altogether? And this is how Modern Horizons was born, and then later expanded to include some Universes Beyond sets. Rather than trying to use Tarmogoyf to sell yet another Modern Master set, what if they just printed something better than Tarmogoyf? The demand would certainly be high for this new card, and that would ensure that the price of the card would also be high, and Wizards could use it to sell a bunch of booster packs, and then Tarmogoyf being $200 or $20 wouldn't really matter anymore because Tarmogoyf wouldn't matter anymore. But it was even better than this for Wizards' bottom line. By releasing these new power creep cards directly into Modern, not only would it create a bunch of new expensive cards that they could reprint in the future and use to sell tons of packs, but they would also force Modern players to buy new decks. If the new cards were enough better than the old cards, it really wouldn't be an option to keep playing that same old deck that you spent $1,000 on for years and years and years, like dusting off that old D&D rulebook. At a minimum, you'd have to update your deck with a bunch of expensive new cards to stay competitive, and you might have to buy a new deck altogether, which would be even better for Wizards. While the original Modern Horizons started the process, I would argue it was Modern Horizons 2 that really perfected the power creep formula. This set was full of unbelievably powerful cards. Cards like Ragavan, Murktide Regent, Urza Saga, the Evoke Elemental, cards that were so much more powerful than the old Modern cards that had to deal with the restriction of being of a power level that was safe to put into standard. And almost as soon as Modern Horizons 2 released, the entire Modern meta changed. Your old Modern deck was either stone unplayable or, best case, would be in need of several $100s of upgrades to remain viable. And it worked. Modern Horizons 2 was the best-selling set of all time. Modern was dominated by cards from the set, to the point where at times, nearly all of the most played creatures in the Modern format were from Modern Horizons 2. Wizards not only made a massive pile of money from the previously under-monetized format, but they also gave themselves a bunch of new expensive cards to reprint, which they embraced almost immediately, using Ragavan to help sell March of the Machines, the Evoke Elementals to support Modern Horizons 3, but everyone needing to buy Ragavans only helps for so long. Sure, Wizards made a huge pile of money last year, but the shareholders want money this quarter. So a year later, they decided to massively push some of the cards from the Universes Beyond Lord of the Rings set, and they did this by changing the cards after they had their Modern Pro contractors look them over and make sure they'd be safe.
The One Ring. While it started with an even more epic name, it was originally called The One Ring, The Ruling Ring. It was also a much less exciting competitive card. It was an unwieldy 5-mana equipment, requiring creature sacrifices to equip and letting you Wheel of Fortune your hand in a much more convoluted way. I tried to build something around cheating this version of the One Ring and to play with Stoneforge Mystic, but it seemed hard to do and there were so many hoops to jump through that it seemed like mostly an ignorable card for the purposes of my work. I can only assume that as a flagship card of the set, it underwent many changes, perhaps specifically because the original version sparked so little excitement among us consultants, and unfortunately, I did not get to see the final version of the One Ring we get to play with nowadays.
To make sure they were not only good enough for Modern, but some of the strongest, most must-have cards in the entire Modern format, the One Ring is just a hilariously overpowered ultra staple, while Orcish Bowmasters almost seemed intentionally designed to punish players who spent $100 on Ragavan when it was the hot new power creepy threat the year before. And it worked again. Lord of the Rings surpassed Modern Horizons 2 to become the new best-selling Modern set of all time, but that was like way back in 2023, which is the distant past in corporate time. The shareholders were hungry now. And that brings us to Modern Horizons 3. If you look through the set, you'll see that many of the cards seem to have been designed to power creep past Orcish Bowmasters, which itself seemed designed to power creep past Ragavan, which Ragavan seemed designed to power creep basically the entire format at the time, with cards like Guide of Souls and a Johnny and Grist having an extra toughness to get out of the range of its pinging ability. Much like with Modern Horizons 2, Modern Horizons 3 basically created an entirely new Modern format. Those decks that you spent $1,200 on to buy or $500 on to update just 2 years ago when Modern Horizons 2 dropped, well, now you gotta do it again if you want to remain competitive and get your Nadus and Flages and Uggin's Labyrinth and Rals. As a result of all this power creep, I've heard some people say that Modern is now a rotating format, with direct-to-modern sets like Modern Horizons or Lord of the Rings even serving as a pseudo-rotation, and while I think this is mostly true, I think there might be an even better comparison. Modern is now one of those scammy video games where you have to spend $70 to get the base game, only to find out that you also need to pay a subscription fee and buy a bunch of DLC and get flooded by microtransactions to actually be able to have fun playing the game. In a weird way, this actually makes perfect sense. A lot of video games kind of stole Magic's booster pack idea and implemented it into their games as loot boxes, and now it's Magic's turn to steal some very player-unfriendly monetization techniques from the video game world. So you might be thinking, when does all this end? When does Modern return to what it was for the first decade of its existence as an expensive but very slow and stable format? And sadly, the answer is, it doesn't. Once the power creep takes hold, it's almost impossible for it to stop, because stopping it would mean making less money this quarter in this year by printing some powered down sets. So instead, next year, Marvel and Final Fantasy will probably rotate Modern again by printing a bunch of super strong cards that are seemingly designed to push the best Modern Horizons 3 cards out of the format, and the year after that we'll likely get Modern Horizons 4 to repeat the process again. Sure, over the long term, the frustration and increasing cost of the format will likely drive some players out of Modern, but that's a future Wizards problem. Right now, there's more immediate concerns, like the shareholders who are at the door, knocking, and the shareholders are hungry. Looking for even more magic? Well, check out the video where I explain the MTG iceberg, or maybe the one about the worst cards to ever be banned in the history of the game.